So I want to talk about this topic of herb-drug interactions. It's something I get asked all the time by my students and just by people in the herbal community. So what's an herb-drug interaction? Well, the idea here is that when someone is taking a medication and they introduce herbal remedies, that there will be some sort of way in which the chemistry or the properties of the herbs influence or affect that drug they're taking, typically in a negative way, right? We usually think of herb-drug interactions as being negative. And that's, of course, kind of what we want to be aware of, but the truth is that there's also positive interactions actually between herbs and drugs that we'll talk about a little bit here. So there's a few different ways that we can see plants interacting with more conventional medications. The first one is what I like to think of as synergistic interactions. And this is essentially, or we can think of it as like an additive action or interaction, which is where essentially the herb is doing a very similar thing that the drug is doing, and so it accentuates the action of that drug. So that could be, sometimes that can be beneficial, sometimes that can be detrimental. So for example, someone might be taking blood pressure medication and they want to introduce an herb that also might lower blood pressure. Say maybe they want to introduce standardized ginkgo extract. Well, that can drop blood pressure a little bit. And obviously we don't want to drop people's blood pressure too low. So that's something that we need to be aware of. Sometimes people are taking, maybe something like cyclobenzaprine as a muscle relaxant, and we want to give them some herbal antispasmodics and nervine hypnotics, like for pain management. Well, that can be an additive effect where they're getting an additional layer of musculoskeletal relaxation and it's just helping the drug do what it's doing and can make it more effective. And in some cases, might be able to make it so that the person can, drop their dosage of the prescription medication. Of course, this is never something that we tell people to do, right? Like exclamation point, bold, underlined, italics, like do not ever tell people, just take less of your drug, or, oh, you don't need to take the drug because here's your herbs. Like, don't do that. That's like where, as herbalists, that's where we have to be very careful. You don't ever tinker with, a doctor's prescription and their recommendations for people. But what we find is that this type of interaction, the synergistic interaction, is where the herbs are in a way supporting the effect of the drug. Again, which can maybe make that drug overly effective to the point where it can cause a problem, like it tilts the scales in too far in one direction. But it can also be one where if that person is in communication with their doctor and their doctor's on board, perhaps they can introduce a weaning schedule to help drop their drugs down. I actually recently had this happen. I was working with a client that has, metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes, and they talked to their doctor about wanting to, introduce some herbs. Doctor said, cool, which is amazing. And so I gave them a formula, and they were working with their doctor and really keeping on top of checking their blood sugar levels. And they were able to cut their dose of metformin in half. They were able to cut their dose of insulin in half just by introducing an herbal formula. Within 3 to 4 weeks, this started happening, and the doctor was actually really excited about it and really encouraging of the client, which is like, hallelujah, like a really amazing moment, because doctors don't always respond in that way. And the client was really, really happy because, according to their doctor, they're going to be able to wean off insulin if they keep up with the way their numbers are looking. Plus there's all these added benefits of like, their triglycerides started going down and their LDL cholesterol started going down and their hemoglobin A1C is looking better, like all this stuff. So this is what I like to think of as a synergistic interaction. Another really interesting example of this is our berberine containing plants, Oregon grape, coptis, golden seal, all those herbs that have that, yellow pigmented berberine alkaloids. There's been studies showing that, now granted the studies were on pure berberine sulfate, but they enhance the efficacy of antibiotics. Like people take antibiotics and the antibiotics don't work against that bacteria, probably because they developed a degree of resistance. They take that antibiotic alongside berberine and the antibiotic becomes more effective. Not to mention berberine also has its own, antibiotic properties alongside with it, but that's what I tend to think of as a synergistic type reaction. We have another herb-drug interaction that I think of as protection interactions. And these are like the best kind, right? What we find is that, obviously there are many drugs out there that can be toxic over the long term. Most, if not all, create some sort of a side effect. And there have been some studies done and showing that some herbs have the ability to protect the body from the toxic effect of some drugs. For example, Cuba berries can protect the kidneys from nephrotoxicity, so that'd be the nephrons of the kidneys, caused by gentamicin. Milk thistle, of course, is like an amazing hepatoprotective herb and has been shown to really protect the liver from, say, damage from excessive amounts of acetaminophen, right? Alongside many other drugs that can be hard on the liver. So we do find that some herbs can actually be very protective of the organs from what can be damaging side effects of, strong drugs like gentamicin, but also what we think of as like a mild drug like acetaminophen, right? That's just over the counter, but in excessive doses can be, pretty detrimental to the body. Then we get into the other category that I think of as, contraindications. And this is where, we really need to be aware as herbalists, which is basically that the herb will interfere with the drug in some way that, in some negative way, right? So a big example here is with St. John's wort, right? And how St. John's wort can potentially interact with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors or SSRI type antidepressants. It could potentially lead to serotonin syndrome, right? Like the mechanism of which St. John's wort acts directly creates a major problem, or can create a major problem in people that might be taking that class of drugs.